Hey, it's Thursday night, about 7:10 in the evening. We're looking at Messier 52. Video for about 45 seconds or so. 52, I believe, is between Cepheus and Cassiopeia. I'm not sure which constellation it's actually in. Very condensed cluster. Looks like it's got a variety of stellar magnitudes, but fairly condensed. Probably a Trumpler class 2 Latin, and maybe a class 2 in terms of its index. I've been videoing now for 39 seconds. This is just a 1-second exposure, giving us an initial view of it. I don't think I will extend the exposure time at all because this is a fine view that you might get at the eyepiece. Let's assume of about a 3-inch telescope. Once again, we have over a 1-degree field of view, and I have it set up to display in square presentation mode on the ASIair and ZWO imager. Okay, I misreported the exposure time of the last image. It was actually 5 seconds, and that also on this exposure time, which means we're probably getting more than a 3-inch view of these two NGC clusters, NGC 7788 and 7790. I'll give a chance for this image once again to form over the next. It already is fully compiled at 5 seconds. The ASIair received a 5-second command with various parameters to capture an image, a single pass. It was passed to the ZWO imager. The imager captured the actual light, returned it to the ZWO, and the ZWO uploaded it back at a fairly good pace because of the position of the scope is presenting the antenna quite nicely from the ASIair. Let's see, what do I call that? I call it a hub. Anyway, there's our view. Here we have NGC 7789, one of my favorite open clusters in the night sky. Highly condensed, perhaps not as much as M11, but it has got a nice swirling of stars, almost galactic in its appearance, with a small group of brighter stars to the above position, a circularity of fainter stars, and spinning off in the direction below. Almost looks like a spiral-esque galaxy of a sort. The cluster was not discovered by Messier, but did turn up in the JLE Dreyer's catalog. I'm not sure who discovered it first, but when they did, they got a very eye-fetching view that you get to share right now on the screen before me. First time I've ever seen it in real-time imaging. Okay, here we're about to see two clusters, NGC 133 and NGC 146. Looks like the two clusters may be there towards the center, which should be 133. 146, this looks like an interesting group of stars here that could easily be part of a cluster, but I suspect maybe here or here is NGC 146. A little difficult to tell, they're not obvious, they're both your general catalog entries. Smaller scope would certainly reveal this one as being a cluster, while these two here would be a little more problematic. There is our view, NGC 133 and NGC 146, open clusters in Cassiopeia. NGC 225 is another open cluster in Cassiopeia. It's pretty clear that it's located right there. There's all these voids surrounding it, so I suspect there is some nebulosity. Data on NGC 225, couldn't tell you, other than that it's in Cassiopeia. It's in the NGC catalog. I do know that it's rated for an 8-inch scope. Should give you the smallest aperture that'll give you a decent view under 5.5 magnitude, visible to the unaided eye seeing conditions. Looks like all the stars are pretty much equal brightness, but they are well distributed. And if you tilt yourself a little bit, you'll see that it looks kind of like a cup, which is something I like to do with deep sky studies, is to get a sense of what they might appear like if they were mundanely represented in the world around us. NGC 225. Not sure what's going to turn out here. NGC 381 needed a pole flip. Wow, I do not see a definitive cluster in this region. This is about a 1-degree field. It's possible that it's a huge open cluster and that is the extent. You can see all kinds of voids around that area. The stars look reasonably round, so apparently the equatorial flip was concluded before I initiated imaging of 5 seconds in duration. As you can see, quite a star-packed region with exception of the various voids that are visible between various groups of stars. Most of those groups consist of maybe a half dozen stars themselves. It's possible we are not seeing the cluster, but I can't be sure because we just concluded an equatorial flip, and therefore everything else I'll be imaging may or may not actually include what we intend to see. NGC 457 required a reversal of the previous equatorial flip. It does look like this may very well be a cluster towards the center of the screen. We've got to keep in mind that Cassiopeia is replete with stars and therefore makes cluster identification a little difficult. So this is our view, NGC 457. Had to wait a bit because, as I mentioned, we had to do a reverse equatorial flip to image it, despite its NGC index number, which I believe was higher than the last. So there is our view, and I do believe I've given it sufficient time so that I can post up any information of note about the cluster. Here we should be seeing NGC 281. I'm seeing a sprinkling of brightest stars right about there. Can't be sure that we are actually seeing it. We did not have to do another equatorial flip to go to 281, but I don't have a lot of confidence that we're seeing anything noteworthy on the screen. We're going to have to turn up a study that is undeniably what we expect it to be in terms of the view. So I'm going to move on to the next study, even though we're going to be a bit shy of the 1 minute I've allocated for each study. Okay, here we have NGC 436. This is obviously a cluster right in this region here. It's not very large. It may extend itself throughout this entire region. We'll have to gather some data on it. Anyway, NGC 436 is found, of course, in Cassiopeia. Initially, the scope tried to do an equatorial flip. When I actually imaged the results, it ended up being streaky, so I knew something was amiss. Went back out, and then reinitialized it, and this time it stayed with the scope to the east of the central declination axis of the mount. So the result is this view here. Another star-rich region of Cassiopeia with one of its numerous open clusters present. Our next cluster should reveal to us whether or not we've actually been centering on open clusters, but it may not be the case. This is Messier 103. should be much more obvious than this. We may have just spent the last half hour chasing ghosts. Messier 103 should be pretty obvious on the screen. Now, one of the complicating factors is we're seeing so many stars on the screen that we may be missing the pattern that astronomers saw through the eyepiece due to a large degree of complexity on the screen. So there's nothing obvious about Messier 103 here. Well, we've done another equatorial flip to NGC 654. We should see it reveal itself shortly, ideally. Oops, we've lost our connection. This has happened several times, especially with the scope pointing from the west towards the east. So I have to go down and disconnect. Oh, come on. I don't know what you're doing here. Okay. Wi-Fi is off? No, Wi-Fi shouldn't be off. Let's see if she reconnects here. Nope. We'll connect up. It should say connect successful. We get an image. Now I think this is the older view, so we're going to have to request it. Some of the vagaries of doing this sort of thing. Come back at you in a moment. What we have here is NGC 654. It will be my last study of the early evening. Auto reconnecting. Okay, don't do that. We actually have NGC 654 there. While I go down, I'm going to reconnect. I'm not going to use that approach. It doesn't work very well. Best approach to do is to go and disconnect and then reconnect here and then reconnect again. Typically shows reconnect succeeded. Then you have to go and reestablish your levels in terms of brightness of the background and the foreground studies. Usually right about there is very nice. All right, I believe this is NGC 654. It has a bright foreground star here. It's got a nice triangular shape there. Another Christmas tree shaped cluster. This is an obvious one, so all the other ones we saw earlier in the evening we were actually looking more or less directly at them. So, without further studies, because I know there's another handful of clusters in Cassiopeia I want to image, I can perhaps take care of them later. I do need to take a break. All right, and if I don't get back at you, carpe noctem. We have NGC 663, a quite compact and easily identified open cluster in Cassiopeia. Very sweet. I'd probably call it a Trumpler class 2-2, fairly condensed, with not too bad of a difference in magnitudinal brightness between the various members. It'd be interesting to look it up. Maybe we'll be able to find that information online. Don't need to have the cursor there in the middle of the field. 663 is probably a very good choice for an eyepiece view through maybe even a 4-inch telescope perhaps might be able to make it discernibly cluster-like. So there is a fine view of NGC 663, open cluster in Cassiopeia. NGC 659 is this cluster here. It was pretty close to our last study over there, which I think it was 663, but I have enough trouble remembering which one we're going to look at next. NGC 659, clearly a cluster, unlike some of the ones we've seen earlier. Took about maybe 3, possibly 4 minutes to get the data from the ASIair unit, and it averaged maybe roughly 200 kilobytes per second. So it should be an interesting exploration in transfer rates. Antenna position plays a huge role. Distance plays a huge role to the ASIair, as well as whether there's any blockages, absorbing blockages or reflecting blockages along the path between the laptop here and the ASIair unit. But here's a nice view of the last two clusters that we are going to see this evening. However, I do want to pick out something of general interest. Not an open cluster to close out on, but if I do not find something of that nature, carpe noctem. All right, what we're looking for here is NGC 2146. I believe a 10-inch or a 12-inch scope should give a decent view of it. And we are actually getting a little bit of a view of it right here towards the middle of the screen. If we can zoom in a little bit, that's very helpful. And I can also move the camera in. You can see that it's kind of an edgy-on presentation. The core is quite bright. There's a swirling aspect to its spiral arms, as you can see there. NGC 2146 is up between Camelopardalis and the Ursa minoris, so it's in the northern aspects. I can play, of course, with the settings for brightness, and we'll see what we can make of it. I darkened it up too much. See if we can find a nice optimal presentation for the best aesthetics, as well as the availability of any texture. Perhaps that's our view right there. Our first galaxy outside of our first galaxy viewed using the 150 El Quattro Newtonian. And it's giving, based on the data I get tomorrow, we should get a better sense of what kind of view. I've never imaged it through the Rev2 system in the 6-inch scope because it's too far north, and the house blocks the observatory for that kind of use. Let's see, I may not have much power left on this camera, so we're going to call this a carpe noctem moment. Zooming in.